Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I've got a lot to get through. I'll try and speak at a good pace, because I know we Australians have a particular twang, but let's see how we go. Mining is something that I guess we take for granted in many ways, and I think in the last 25 years especially, there's been this reframing, and we're seeing it reframed again, and part of the transitions that we're going through now, looking at the eventual close of things like coal and so on, to be replaced by other metals, is the next transition that we have to think about. Normally I would like to spend a bit of time explaining all of these photos and what they mean and so on, but yeah, a pit in the middle there, 13 gigalitres of pH 2 water, that's the legacy from Mount Morgan. And the profits that flowed from Mount Morgan founded BP. So it was so rich in its early days that the legacy was William Knox Darcy going and investing in oil in Persia, and next thing you had BP. So transitions is something that the industry's done many times, but often not well. Right? And I think one of the work, the area where I'll focus my work is really what's that environmental legacy. Right? How do we look at, if we're looking at the longer term trajectory of mining, how do you ascribe sustainability thinking to that? All right, so, and again, there's lots of other examples you could use there, but they're for another time perhaps. It's an old cliche, we don't grow it, we mine it, and yes, it's true, like a lot of cliches, but I think we know it's not that simple. Growing stuff is not necessarily all that easy, mining stuff is not all that easy, and nor is it necessarily the right answer either. All right, so when we're thinking about it, I love using this cartoon still, it's still one of my most favourite cartoons. We've been talking about a transition for decades. Now, climate change is really the big driver of that, of course, but it's not about saying that some parts of the world, well, they've already developed, they're fine, the rest of the world can't. It's how do we get that balance right? What's most sustainable for the planet, for different parts of the world, and so on. Right? And so really, that's a pretty big constraint. That's something we have to think very, very hard about. And that's why it's a real pleasure to be here and actually to engage in these sort of conversations. Because I think by being here and having the multidisciplinary expertise here, we can get a lot further down that pathway, down that journey. I'm sure people have seen these, the SDGs for acronym lovers, Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And it's been really, I think, kind of inspiring, because the mining industry has taken up the SDGs and framing a lot of their work around how they contribute to SDGs, because they do have a very important role to play in helping achieve SDGs, especially in some parts of the world. But it ain't easy, all right? And some of these connections are not necessarily obvious, all right? And I think that's our job as sort of researchers, as scholars in this space, is to help make those connections and to make sure we've got the evidence base, and so that we can really move forward on some of these things. But I've also learned that you go back through history. You go back to Agricola, originally a doctor, a GP, and most of his patients were miners, often dying, because they were getting exposed to radon gas in the mines, and so they didn't understand it then. But Agricola then decided he wanted to be a metallurgist, and so he spent the last half of his life actually as a metallurgist and promoting mining. And so his book that came out the year after he died is still a classic. Download it for free if you like. But so we could look at this and we could say, well, that's sustainability in action. Looking at the relationship between, if you have no environment, there's no community. With no community, there's no economy. So we might put modern language of a triple bottom line or 3 pillars. We've heard about different forms of capital this morning as well. We've already heard this. This is not a new problem. The scale is different. And that scale is something I want to really focus on. Because really, mining is different to agriculture. The amount of food we need per day is pretty much a constant thing. Right? The amount of metals we're using, not only are we using more metals, but we're using more different metals. For people who have followed or looked into something like peak oil, and the name Marion King Hubbert should be familiar, Hubbert didn't actually invent the concept. He actually got it from Hewitt. And Hewitt was talking about peak metals. And Hubbert said, well, what about peak oil? Everyone thinks we talk about peak oil as if Hubbert invented the whole concept, but he didn't. He got it from Hewitt, and Hewitt was one of his lifelong mentors. And I think Hewitt captured this in one of his papers in 1929. And so really this is what we're talking about. We're looking at pretty much now, and we saw this earlier today, I think it was in Edmund's talk, we're using more and more of the periodic table all the time. And so for a lot of these sort of more exotic metals, technology metals, specialty metals, we're using more and more of them. And historically we never worried about them, but and when they're growing at a much, much faster rate than our traditional metals like copper or iron, etc. And these are the technologies. This is just a selection. You could put up all sorts of different photos here, but again, thinking about things like gallium. Just because we haven't really worried about reporting it doesn't mean we don't have much. Of course we have a lot. It's in bauxite, it's in zinc deposits, it's in many parts of the Earth's crust. Or germanium, or looking at the rare earths, one of those poorly named group of metals, unfortunately, but and because they're called rare, people think they're rare. And they're not. They're actually quite abundant, but incredibly useful. I think one of the papers that Tom Gradell has just published more recently, he now calls them spice metals. Metals, like you do with salt on fish and chips or things like that. So a small bit adds a lot of flavour in the case of food, but in the case of metals, like with alloys, a small bit actually adds some really important functionality, whether it be magnetics, corrosion, or all sorts of things. Also with rhenium, you've got high temperature, super performing alloys. So you can get onto the internet and download some data and have a bit of fun. I'm guilty of that probably far too often. But if you look at the real value of the mining industry over the long term, so this is in 1998 dollars, and looking at the real value of the industry over time and separating it out between our primary metals such as base metals, iron-related metals, and then also what we would now call our critical metals. You can barely notice those critical metals in there. They really are spice metals. So they're really this small group of metals that add a lot of functionality to everything else. Sure, they'll grow faster, but they're still pretty small. Now, one of the things I'd like to do with this is add coal into the picture and then delete that out by 2050, for example. And it'd be very interesting to see how that looks. So really, when we're thinking about it, mining, in some ways, we still have this basic logic, and this is a lot of the discussion that we've had today. A deposit is finite. Sure, you can drill more, find more, go to lower grades, and so on. And the industry's been very successful at, whether it's technology, whether it's exploration. We're producing more now than we ever have before. So the question really is not, how much we have left. The question really should be, well, what's the impact? Right? And so that, to me, when we're thinking about sustainability, which is the ability to keep doing something on a sustained basis for whatever time period we want to choose, that's what it comes down to. How long can we keep sustaining these growing impacts? All right? And so ultimately, that's the big question for me, is that I think, and it's a lot of the work I've been doing for many years now, how do we quantify that impact? How do we look at that? And how do we make sure we connect the dots? And if I can achieve that today, I'll have hopefully done a good job. Let's look at Australia, and it's a good model, a good exemplar for the rest of the world. And we can see the gold rush there in yellow, the 1800s, mid-1800s. Made Australia rich for a while. But we can see the last 30, 40, 50 years. There's been an absolute exponential growth. I haven't updated that chart, and some of those charts will be double what they are now. If you look at iron ore, we're now 1 billion tonnes a year. Just rolls off the tongue. 1 billion tonnes a year goes out the ships. Quite remarkable. And yet in 1938, Australia banned iron ore exports because we didn't think we had enough. Well, actually, it wasn't the real reason. I think the real reason is the exports were destined for Japan. And the Australian government didn't want to say that we can't export to Japan because that would be a sort of a faux declaration of war before it actually happened. So they used the excuse that we don't have enough, therefore we are banning iron ore exports. And that was a policy that left unchanged until 1960. So it's pretty obvious, the old basic pattern there, it's just exponential growth. How long can we keep that pattern going? So we're not talking about 10 million tonnes of iron ore or 100 million tonnes of iron ore. We're now talking about 1 billion tonnes of iron ore, a multiple of that with waste rock. And that's just the iron ore sector. Then you've got copper, gold, and everything else. in the coal sector. All right, so let's look at what that means in terms of value over time. So if we just work out, and it's, it's fiddly and annoying, but you can get there, what's the value over time? And what's the proportional value for each of the different metals that we've mined in Australia? So we started with coal. Our first exports went to India. Then we had the Copper Kingdom, the 1840s, the decade before the gold rush. And what should be obvious is we've already gone through transitions in Australia before. The gold rush rose and fell, peak gold in action. We've had another gold boom over the last 40 years, which is, again, a different set of conditions that led to, to the gold sector. But look how dominant coal is in the last sort of 50 to 60 years. And it's not just the value there, it's also just the sheer scale as well. So again, in some ways, we've adapted. We've already gone through transitions, opening up new industries or closing down some of the sectors. So there are examples we can look to. Now, if we're looking at this question of sustainability, like, well, how long can we keep these patterns going? Pretty long, actually. That's remarkable. When you look at, this is from a paper I published last year, where I just looked at, well, what's our trends in cumulative production, developing Hubbard-style curves, and saying, well, let's look at all the traditional metals on our left, all the critical metals on the right. And clearly, for most of these, we've still got more left in the ground than we've already produced to date. So the question, is not so much that whether we have enough left. The question is how we mine, where we mine, what we mine. Do we move to uranium and nuclear power, or do we move more to lithium and battery storage and renewables? I'd always choose the latter. Part of that, in understanding the impact, is that grades are declining. And this is something that I always find bizarre, that no one had put data together. It was a well-understood problem. It's not like I invented it, but I was just the fool that was stupid enough to go through all the manual labour to start pulling the data together. Right? And so you can see copper here. And again, that long-term trend is all downhill. And we know from the deposits and the mineral resource base that it's going to continue to go downhill. Right? So when you're looking at it, the corollary to that is waste. And I start with that, or, that's where I started my career, is, well, I've got one tailings dam. I'm actually earning a PhD out of it. It's that complicated and causing that much seepage into groundwater, so it earned me my PhD. And I remember thinking, well, that's one site. What about the thousands and tens of thousands across Australia? How are we managing those? Surely not all of them are going to be perfect. And so if we think about that, let's assume we've got 99% of our waste rock and our tailings management perfect. And I mean perfect, such that we never have to worry about it. We can walk away. The rehabilitation is going to work. Have no problems whatsoever. So 1% is problematic. We're taking 1% of tens of billions of tonnes every year and adding that up. That's a problem. And that's assuming my assertion of 99% is accurate. And I think that's obviously way overly optimistic. So it's pretty obvious that trend is exponential. That is not a trend that can continue. All right? What do we do about that? Well, that's the big question. All right? And this is what communities are responding to. And so when you're looking at communities, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Chile, whether it's in South Africa, in anywhere in the world, mine waste will be one of the biggest long-term concerns. And it still stuns me that no one was putting data together on it. People understand how much manual labour is involved, I kind of get it, but this is the big thing. Waste rock takes up a huge amount of land, it's problematic to manage, and it takes a lot of effort. So we really should have a better account of it. All right? So you can go through and work out a rough estimate globally of how much waste we're producing globally. And we're getting up to, if you modernise those numbers, and I haven't had a chance to sort of update these yet, but that'll be soon, we're probably close to 100 billion tonnes a year of mine waste every year. That's every year. That's not just cumulative, that's just that year. All right, so if I was to run the numbers for 2020 or 2021, I'd be very confident we'd be getting to at least 100 billion tonnes, if not more. All right, that's huge. Imagine that. Imagine 99% perfect and 1% of that is problematic every year. That's a huge burden to the environment and to communities. All right. So ultimately, when you're looking at it, we have to reframe things. We have to reframe and get a lot better with the way we deal with our management of mining. What we mine, so what are we choosing? So, so if we start to, as we continue the transition away from coal and fossil fuels, and uranium is flat, so that, and I don't think there's as much future for nuclear power, but we are seeing this rapid shift in renewables, a rapid uptake of electric vehicles now. Things are changing, and that means that the metals that we need are changing. So we'll explore that. This is a couple of years old, but I think I've left it deliberately, and it's just basically taking historical production, which we can see in the sort of the red lines there for, say, cobalt on the left and lithium on the right. And you could put a couple of different regressions on there, and let's just model that and project that forward, which is what the dotted lines are. And they're basic and they work, they give you an OKR squared, but then we can say, well, let's choose a scenario. Right, let's assume the new policy scenarios, as the IEA would call it, or the sustainable development scenario. So what's the future that we want? We could choose a future that's 1.5 degrees, under Paris, or we could say, well, let's just look at where we're heading and just assume that we'll get to 5 degrees instead. All right? So if we choose these optimistic, the scenarios that we really want to see, such as a 1.5 degree, limit on our warming, then this implies a transition in the number of electric vehicles we need, and therefore what that means in terms of batteries. And so if people aren't familiar with the acronyms around batteries, NMC, so nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, so LFP, the lithium iron phosphate batteries, that's pretty big. If you start multiplying it out, how many electric vehicles, so if we start manufacturing all of our vehicles using electric vehicles, and the amount of metals we need for that, we can see that we're multiplying our current cobalt and lithium demand by somewhere between 5 to 10 times. We've done it in the past in the mining industry, right? So it's not impossible at all, as long as we understand the targets, the sustainability issues and so on, right? And that's where I think we've got to get a lot better, right? Now this is just a bit of a noisy graph, a lot of detail, but what I want to show is that there is an enormous amount of cobalt out in the world. We have a huge amount. Australia has pretty much as much cobalt as the Congo, just that ours is locked up in nickel laterite or in copper deposits, which is not easy to get the cobalt out of. All right, so there's no shortage of cobalt. A lot of variation there, and there's going to be a lot of detail there, looking at grade versus size and things like that, but and all the different types of deposits that contain cobalt. So we're not short, really. The question is, the responsibility or the sustainability of that supply chain and making sure that it's timely for the manufacturers that use it, or like Tesla's